two other philosophers we're going to deal with right now. Scientists, yes, but mostly it's the philosophy that we look at, the theories, because they're not laws, are going to be Piaget and Kolbert. Piaget, Piaget, was a Swiss physician, stumbled across studying children because he had some nephews and he was figuring out how they worked, and he published it, and it turns out that he got a lot of credit for doing what he was doing. Piaget's theory is developed into 4 stages, and like Freud, stops at about the age of 12. And they are stages, which means at each stage, a child can either pass or fail a certain task. Now, in Piaget's first stage, sensory motor, which goes to about the age of 2, until they start moving around and crawling, 1.5, 18 months. What it is they have these tiny little hands and tiny little feet, and they can't really do anything for themselves. So in Piaget's time, we didn't realize that they were actually thinking, so we called this the sensory motor stage, where they kind of just reacted to the environment and sat there on their backs or fell asleep and ate and pooped and whatnot, and not a whole lot of thinking was going on. We now realize that there's actually a whole lot of thinking that's going on, but in Piaget's day, they didn't really know. At ages 2 to 7, they're developing what's called theory of mind, which is essentially empathy, which is something that very few animals actually can do. Look at someone and realize that from that person's perspective, the world is just a little bit different. Something very few animals can actually do. At about the age of 7, 5, 6, 7 maybe, to about the age of 11, they go through the concrete operational stage. And the concrete operational stage is fun because this is when they have their literal meaning. So a lot of those elementary school jokes, 2 guys walk into a bar, 3rd guy ducks. The literal jokes. Knock knock. Knock knock jokes. Those are great for little kids. Magic tricks. Because what Piaget learned was that children actually can keep track of things eventually when they don't see them. For example, if, here's the test, they have a wall, actually this was a carrot, and they pass 2 carrots behind a wall. And I can't do this, but maybe I should try some magic tricks with a video. But so 1 carrot came out the other side, and when they passed it back through, it was 2 over here. And then 1, and then 2. And what they do is, they see how long a baby looks at it. And it turns out the baby will look at it a long time trying to figure out why exactly 1 goes in one side and 2 comes out the other. That's how we know the babies are actually thinking about this stuff. At a certain age, they don't look at it. At a certain age, they try to figure it out. And what that stage is, concrete operational. Another task of the concrete operational stage is called conservation. The conservation goes like this. I have 2 rolls of clay. Straight from the factory, should be about the same size. That one's been played with before. Alright. Is there the same amount of clay in each of these? Your answer is probably going to be yes. However, what if I do this? Aggression. Now, if I show you this, and I show you this, which one has more? Now, they're going to be the same, right? But if you ask someone who hasn't gone through the concrete operational stage with conservation, they're going to say the bigger one has more. And it's great, because at this stage, you can just ask them over and over again, and they're going to say, which one has more? Yeah? And you roll this one back into a little ball, just like it was before. Which one has more? They're the same. Bam. Oh, it's dirty now. Which one has more? The bigger one has more again. And roll it back up. Which one has more? They're the same. I did this with my nephew, and he must have been ready to make that stage because the first time he said this one has more, the bigger one has more. The second time I did it, he said they were the same. So he made that stage as we were doing it. Which is a big problem with Piaget's theories, is that a lot of this stuff is controversial because these kids can be taught these things outside of the stage system. Or perhaps they just don't understand the word bigger or the word more. They might think the word more actually means bigger. So there's a lot of problems with the concrete operational stage and all of Piaget's stages, but it's common enough that we can get a certain idea of what's going on. Because most kids at this early, before preschool, as preschool age, just as they're getting symbolic language, will go through that stage. And then Piaget's last stage is formal operations, when we actually learn logic. And like Freud stops at age 12, from then on, you're just all the same. Kohlberg, on the other hand, is called moral development. Now, Kohlberg's sense of moral development isn't the idea of what is morality and how do people act morally. That's something different, and that's cultural. This is more about what reasons do people use for acting morally or immorally. And his stages, he's got 6, they're subdivided into 3. Pre-conventional, which is you're very young. It's about behaviorism. If you do something, are you going to get punished or rewarded? And for a 3-year-old, punish and reward is an excellent way of figuring out how to act morally. Because there's usually going to be some person in charge telling you what to do that's right or wrong. Unless you didn't pass that trust and you don't trust your adult to tell you what's right or what's wrong, then you're not going to care. Then you're going to kind of think your parents are kind of just wandering around doing nothing aimlessly, or, don't care about you. So you're going to figure this stuff out on your own. But for most people, they have this parent telling them what's good or what's bad, and they're going to reward or punish them for it. And at this stage, a mom who says, just do it because I said so, it's usually going to be enough for a kid, unless that kid doesn't trust the parent. Because when it comes right down to it, a 3-year-old and a puppy dog are going to react a lot the same way to rewards and punishment. When a kid gets to be about 3 or 4 years old, 5, maybe 6, they start to learn a reciprocity, or, the legal system. Whereas there's going to be ways to get around the rules. Like, I do this for you if you do that for me. This is when you can have contracts with your kids. Clean your room and you'll get a cookie. Essentially, this is going from classical behaviorism, classical conditioning, to operant conditioning, where they have a little more planning involved. But if you back off and don't follow up with your rules, they're going to catch you, because they're little lawyers at this point. Stage 3, which is roughly 5th grade, 6th grade, is going to be a social harmony stage, whereas people act good because it's good for society. And you're likely to please other people. You're likely to please the teacher. You don't need a reward, but, causing disruptions is going to be bad because it's bad for society. Level 4, which Kohlberg argued was as high as most people get, is your law and order side, which is if you do something wrong, society will punish you. Again, punishing. And the reason for this is because if you do something wrong and you don't get punished, that's bad for society. Stage 5 would be considered a social contract, whereas the rules can be changed. If you're concerned about how the rules affect other people, they can be changed. Stage 4, with law and order, the rules, they're set by other people. They're not really there to be changed. People are just law enforcement officers. At stage 5, you realize that, the laws are fluid and they can change based on what society wants or values. And then stage 6 is a little bit of an abstract notion, whereas rules are just kind of ethereal things. They're guidelines. They're not actual rules or laws. And it's based on if a law is wrong. If a law is against life in general, then the law is bad and should be changed or even under-acknowledged. There is so much wrong with Kohlberg's theory that it just constantly gets a lot of attention. For example, the feminist movement argued that males and females don't go through the stages in the same way. Females tend to be more concerned for other people rather than the law and order. And there's just so much wrong with it that it's argued. However, where it's used in society is in college application issues. Whereas if you're writing an essay, they want to know what stage you're at. Are you at the law and order stage? Or are you above the law and order stage where rules can be changed and are abstract. Because colleges are looking for people who are willing to change the world. But you have to know something about the world and have the idea that laws are there to help people, not just there to punish people. And the higher moral reasoning a student has, the more likely they are to succeed in classes where you have to think abstractly and think outside the box in terms of changing the world. Now, those two theories are in human development. However, we're going to go back now and follow Erikson, because Erikson is the major stage system that we follow. Avoiding controversy. I don't want to start any controversies here, but developmentally, life starts at conception, because at conception, we begin developing. I'm not making any political statement on that at all. I'm just saying that in terms of human development, we start developing at the zygote stage. There's problems with considering the egg and the sperm as alive, because the sperm essentially operates as a virus, and if we consider the sperm and egg to be alive, then we have to consider the virus to be alive, and we don't really consider the viruses to be alive, because they need other cells to act, or they die. So, biologically speaking, the egg and the sperm aren't really life forms in of themselves until they meet and form a zygote. It's controversial. It's one of the few actual controversies in biology. And biologists won't call it a controversy because they think it's settled. Once a zygote has been, I don't know what's the word, created, formed, the thing we have to watch out for is called teratogens. Teratogens are anything that causes harm to the developing zygote, to the developing fetus. And most of these teratogens, and it comes from, you'll see the word terror in there, because they can form deformities. For example, Zika. A lot of these teratogens have their effect before even the mother knows she's pregnant. Which is why you'll see in medication commercials, don't take this drug if you're pregnant or think you can become pregnant. Because a lot of these developmental problems happen before the mom even knows. Then there's other problems like Down syndrome. There's deformities in the chromosomes. Now these types of genetic problems are more common in older women who have children. So it's something to be careful of if you've reached that 35, 36 to 40 to even 50 these days and having children. Then when we're born, there's certain things we're born with. First, I'm going to mention the reflexes. For example, rooting, which is a baby's natural tendency to, if you touch a baby's cheek, it'll go towards whatever that is and suck on it, because that's a survival instinct, to know that if there's a source of milk nearby, to go ahead and be actively drinking that milk. We're born with familiarity of the person or people who've been speaking around us. We are born with an ability to recognize our own language from someone else's language, because we've heard it in the womb. And probably most importantly, we're born with what's called temperament, which is your first stages of personality. There are little bits of personality that we are born with. And effectively, what they are reactiveness, how quickly we are to react to something, how quickly we are to cry, and then how quickly we are to calm down. Reactiveness. And also processing speed, the ability that we think. Now, processing speed is mostly, from what we know, affected by how well those neurons are myelinated, how well that fat system is around those neurons to get them signals traveling. But while we're young, those brain cells are still moving in the direction of where they're going to be in the brain. And they're creating those pathways even after we're born. In fact, the brain does not stop developing until we reach... You know what? Let me ask you this. At what age do you feel that people are considered to be adults? Now, you might say 18, but honestly, do you feel that 18-year-olds are treated like adults? What age do you think society, actually, and parents especially, actually treat their children like adults? Now, the average answer is going to be about 26, 27 years old. And the reason for that, probably, it's a correlation, is that the brain, especially that frontal cortex, that decision-making part, doesn't actually finish developing until about the age 26, 27 years old. But we're still working with babies. So another major development in developmental psychology of babies was a monkey experiment by Harlow, a guy named... and in Harlow's monkey studies, he wanted to know, do monkeys prefer a cloth mother who doesn't provide food, or a wire-cold mother who does provide food? And it turns out, if you haven't already watched the video, spoiler alert, that the monkey prefers the warm, soft mother unless it's hungry, then it goes to the wire mother for food, and then back to the cloth warm mother for comfort. Which means, as babies, we want warm comfort, but we also need food, but when we're not hungry, we want warmth. In the meantime, we're going back to Erikson for what's called the strange situation. So, that first stage is trust versus mistrust. How do we know whether a baby is trusting of a parent? Ainsworth and Bowlby came up with a test. And what it is called the strange situation. Does a baby trust a parent? And in this situation, this experiment, what they do is they have the parent and the baby together in the room, and then they have a stranger walk in. And they see if the baby even notices. Probably not, it's not a big deal. Then they have the parent leave the room. And we want to see if the child has this attachment to the parent, if they feel separation anxiety. Now, if the parent leaves the room and the stranger begins to interact with the baby, the normal response is that the baby should start crying. And then when the parent returns to the room, the baby should calm down relatively quickly, if the child has learned to trust the parent to keep the child safe. Now, the other forms of attachment fall into three categories. And the first category is going to be your avoidant type. These are the kids who have learned that they can't trust the parent to keep them safe or to meet their needs. These kids tend to not notice, or they don't show that they notice, when the parent leaves. They've done blood testing on these kids to find out that there is a stress level increase when the parents leave, but they don't show it. Because they've learned that crying isn't going to get attention anyway, so why bother? So these kids, when the parent leaves, don't show any distress. And when the stranger interacts with them, they don't even care. I mean, they don't consider it to be distressing at all. I mean, they do, it's stressful, but they're not going to show it. And this is called the avoidant type. The other type, called ambivalent, are the ones who get upset just as soon as the parent leaves, and when the parent comes back, they still don't calm down. Because they know that as long as they're upset, they're going to get attention. And they need that attention. So they're going to keep crying, regardless of whether the parent is back or not. The fourth type is a very small percentage, and it's called disorganized, and essentially the kid doesn't know what to do, because they may get punished for reacting emotionally, or they might get beaten and they don't understand. They've not learned whether they can trust the parent, but they've not even learned how to react. So this is going to be usually with your abused kids. It's a very small percentage. Now, these interaction types are essentially learned. It is the parents' responses that, for the most part, establish this. And they learn this because if you take a kid who's avoidant, or if you take a kid who's ambivalent, and you put them into a secure environment, eventually they'll begin to act more secure. If you take a kid out of the secure environment, put him into one of the other environments, they don't tend to become insecure, they'll stay secure. But if you take the insecure kids, put them into a secure environment, they'll actually respond towards the secure. Now, this is major league cultural, because if you go to Germany, where parents don't treat their kids emotionally, you'll find more avoidant children, more kids who don't react emotionally. If you go to an Eastern society where the parents are always hovering over their children, you'll find them to be more ambivalent or more resistant to having the parent leave at all, because it's what they've grown used to. Now, do children need attention to develop normally? Answer is yes. And the reason we know this is because there were orphanage studies done in Romania, where the orphans, the kids, the babies, were just put in cribs and they're left alone. And it turns out their brains don't develop as much as if they got the attention and stimulus that they need. Another major study in this, and don't do this at home, was they took kittens, and each of these brain stages has a sensitive period. And this is important for why we have these stages. there's these sensitive periods. For example, this trust series, the brain has a sensitive period when it's going through this neurotic stage. A major example of this would be, don't do this at home. Researchers took cats, and there's a sensitive stage just after the cat's eyes open, where the brain is developing that new stimulus into how it's going to process vision. And they put these cats, just after their eyes open, into a black cage for 2 weeks, a box, and then they let them out. And these cats never could quite see correctly, because while their brains were developing the ability to see color vision, or the ability to see, their brains were getting no stimuli in vision. And so when they were let out of the box, their brains had already moved on to something else more critical, and just figured that there was no light and nothing's ever going to be able to see. And those cats never did pick up normal vision because the brain had moved on. Same thing with human language. At about the age of 2 to 3, that part of the brain is developing, and so we learn language really quickly at that age. After the brain's done developing its pathways, it gets harder to learn language. Feral children who are raised in the wild without language, or, in modern day culture, raised in closets without interaction, never do learn actual fluent speech. They'll learn telegraphic speech, because it is much easier to learn language at the age of 3 to 5 than it is to learn at 15, 20, 30. We may learn the words just fine, and the grammar may come with a little bit of effort, but that natural fluent accent is going to be very difficult to develop after the sensitive period is passed. And there's reason to believe that sensitive periods in terms of brain development affect all of these stages, which is why these critical crises are so important at the time. A parent who says, "Oh, don't worry about that boyfriend, girlfriend, you'll get over it, it's no big deal." That's because they've moved on. It's not as critical to them. Their brains aren't developing that area at that time. But as the teenager, that's the end-all and be-all of life at the moment, because that's what the brain is going through. A toddler, moving around, learning independence, is the end-all and be-all of existence at the time, because that's the part of the brain that's developing at that moment. Identity versus role confusion. This is the stage where we learn, can we assume an adult role in society? The major theory on this is by a man named James Marcia, who developed a 4-trait system during these teenage years. The first set, or the first stage, but they're not really stages because you might not go through them at all, is identity diffusion, whereas identity doesn't even really matter. What do I care? I've got other things to worry about. I've not even made it to that stage yet, or if I have made it to the stage, it doesn't really matter. Identity development, I don't really care. Identity diffusion. I might still be worried about schoolwork and have to worry about identity until I get confident in self-esteem. Then I can worry about, what my role in society is going to be. Foreclosure, that's where a kid just figures that, the parents are right. What the parents have told me, that's what I'll do, and I'm fine with it. No crisis. There's commitment, no crisis. Moratorium is where a kid's going through anxious development, searching things out, exploring that goth or that emo or that tattoo culture or the nerdy kids or the chair or the jocks or the whatever, all the cliques. They're exploring. They're developing what their personality is going to be, their role in society. They're experiencing the crisis, but they've not made a commitment. And then the fourth stage would be identity achievement, where they make a commitment to which identity they're going to choose. And then if they make their identity choice, and there's not a crisis anymore, or if there never was a crisis, they can move on. One major issue with identity and role is that if a person, for example, has a baby and they put off their own development, they can put off that development for a good 7-8 years until that child is at an age where it is self-sufficient, and then return to that identity development stage, which is usually a problem for the kid because the kid needs a stable adult, whereas the adult has now gone back to try to figure out what it missed during that identity stage. That happens a lot. Intimacy versus isolation.